Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar from the Council of State Governments, or CSG East. Thank you all for joining. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm a policy analyst at CSG, and I am the committee liaison for CSG East Education and Workforce Development Committee. For anyone unfamiliar with CSG, we're the nation's only nonpartisan organization serving all three branches of state government. We're composed of 4 regions, and CSG East serves U.S. states Maryland up to Maine, U.S. Eastern Territories, and Eastern Canadian provinces. The topic of today's webinar is Funding Workforce Development, Federal Opportunities for States. In this webinar, we'll hear from speakers from the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Transportation, where they'll be discussing federal funding opportunities for states made available through federal legislation and initiatives. As we've heard from our members, both on the legislative and executive branches, one common theme is how can we pay for workforce development initiatives? It's our pleasure to bring this program to you all and to help you in your respective states answer that question. With me today is our communications specialist, Dylan McDowell. He'll be monitoring the chat for questions and is available to assist with any technical issues should you encounter any. Dylan, do you mind sharing your email in the chat? Thank you in advance. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you need any support during using this feature, please reach out to Dylan. Today, we're joined by Paige Shevlin from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Paige is the strategic advisor for infrastructure workforce development at the U.S. Department of Transportation. In that role, she is responsible for implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law in a way that promotes high-quality jobs and greater diversity in the infrastructure workforce. We're also pleased to welcome Emlyn Bottomley from the U.S. Department of Labor. Emlyn is a policy analyst at the Department of Labor's Good Jobs Initiative, where his work focuses on leveraging data to advance the department's industrial strategy and promote job quality. Thank you both for joining us to discuss federal initiatives in your respective departments. With that, I'll go ahead and pass to Emlyn to get us started. Emlyn, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Emlyn Bottomley. As you said, I'm a policy analyst at the Department of Labor's Good Jobs Initiative, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Very excited to talk about how DOL is working with federal agencies and state, local, territory, and tribal governments to ensure that Build, CHIPS, and IRA investments create high-quality jobs and equitable pathways into those jobs. I'll also share some information about DOL grants supporting workforce development and touch on how states can play a leadership role in leveraging grant making and procurement processes to develop the skilled workforce needed to deliver on these projects. In January of 2022, the Department of Labor announced the Good Jobs Initiative in order to provide critical information to workers, employers, and governments as they strive to improve job quality and create access to good jobs for all working people. Next slide, please. The Good Jobs Initiative coordinates DOL sub-agency and cross-agency work under one umbrella to promote equitable and high-quality jobs. And our work has 3 main components. The first is worker empowerment. We provide easily accessible information to workers about their rights to minimum prevailing wages, safe and healthy workplaces, and the right to form a union and bargain collectively with their employer. We also work with high-road employers as partners in improving job quality and developing workforce pathways to good jobs. And finally, we provide critical support to government partners. The Good Jobs Initiative assists federal agencies, including through providing technical assistance on grants, contracts, and other investments designed to improve job quality. Next slide, please. To date, the Good Jobs Initiative has entered into a memorandum of understandings with the Department of Transportation, Commerce, and Energy that establish joint commitments to using Build, CHIPS, and IRA funds to support good jobs and equitable workforce development pathways. And these MOUs have facilitated collaborative efforts with these partners to incentivize equity and good jobs in over $97 billion of competitive grant funding. These incentives are often in the form of preferences or merit points that prioritize grant proposals, which agree to adopt project-level labor standards supporting equity and job quality, which may include the use of project labor agreements, collective bargaining agreements, or community benefits agreements, implementing local and economic hiring agreements, the adoption of health and safety plans and workplace safety and health committees or management systems, utilizing registered apprenticeship programs and pre-apprenticeship programs, and provisioning supportive services such as childcare to workers and training participants. For a more comprehensive list of these provisions and language, which can be embedded in funding opportunities to incentivize job quality and equity, we encourage you to visit goodjobs.gov. In partnership with the Department of Commerce, we've also established shared good jobs principles, which identify the essential elements of a quality job. These job quality principles have guided our work with federal partners and other workforce stakeholders, and have also been adopted across the federal government and beyond. We've also engaged with both small and large employers across the country to showcase how they are recruiting and retaining diverse workers by investing in training, higher wages, benefits, and respecting workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain. Through this work, we've hosted events like the Black Businesses Building Good Jobs panel, where former Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh and Black business owners discussed the importance of quality jobs. And finally, we've created a one-stop job quality resource center for federal investments at goodjobs.gov and relaunched and updated worker.gov to serve as a hub for helping workers understand their rights and accessing resources at the Department of Labor. We developed a number of resources, including our Good Jobs Toolkit and our Project Labor Resource Center to assist federal, state, local, territory, and tribal governments in leveraging federal infrastructure funds to support high-quality jobs. And more generally, the Department of Labor invests in workforce development initiatives through both Formula Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funds, or WIOA funds, and discretionary grant programs. Several DOL grants, such as the Critical Sector Job Quality Grants, the Building Pathways to Infrastructure Jobs Grant Program, and the Youth Build Construction Pre-Apprenticeship Program, may be particularly well suited to training participants for infrastructure careers, and we encourage you to look at those programs. For a list of open discretionary grant announcements, you can find those on the current grant funding opportunities page of the Employment and Training Administration's website. But this is also an area where states can lead. Some federal infrastructure programs provide flexibility to directly fund workforce development, and Paige will be talking a little bit more about that during her presentation. However, states can also leverage federal infrastructure funds to incentivize subgrantees to invest in equitable workforce development. The majority of bill funds are formula or block funds distributed to states, localities, tribes, and territories. And as state leaders, you have a great deal of discretion over how this money is awarded, subgranted out, or leveraged through procurement and contracting processes. That creates a tremendous opportunity to incentivize, or if there's statutory authority, to require that subgrantees or contractors invest in workforce development and partner with CBOs or other community groups to recruit, train, and retain workers from underserved communities. That could mean requiring the utilization of registered apprenticeships or prioritizing projects that develop or support joint labor management training programs. It could also include implementing local hire agreements on bill or other federally funded projects that provide pathways for underserved communities to access these jobs. The NOFO language on goodjobs.gov or the Notice of Funding Opportunity language on goodjobs.gov can serve as a jumping off point, but your state might be able to go even further in assuring job quality and developing equitable workforce development pathways. We would love to partner with you if you are considering how your state can leverage its grant making or procurement authority to support equitable workforce development. And you can contact us at goodjobsinitiative@dol.gov. And I hope to talk a little bit more about this during the Q&A. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Thank you, Emlyn, for giving us some background on the Department of Labor's Good Job Initiative. Now let's hear from Paige about opportunities from the Department of Transportation and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Paige, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today. Paige Shevlin, I'm the Strategic Advisor for Infrastructure Workforce Development at the U.S. Department of Transportation. I'm going to talk about how transportation funds can be used for workforce development. As I do this, I'm going to talk about different types of funding that are available. We'll start off by saying that there is very little direct funding available for workforce development from the Department of Transportation. So it takes a little bit more work to figure out how we can fund workforce development. There are ways to do it. I do want to start with the direct funding that does exist, just so that people are aware of those rare opportunities. There is a set of dedicated funding for workforce development for transit agencies that are moving to zero emission fleets. that allows them to train their existing workforce for the new skills needed for those electric fleets. And then in addition, we do have a rail program that does offer funding for workforce development projects that relate to rail training. I may come back to those later, but those are really the two direct sources of workforce development funding. Our biggest set of funding that we are trying to influence, as Emlyn was talking about, is our competitive grants through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We have $125 billion that is available in competitive funds. As Emlyn was discussing, we have worked with the Department of Labor to create preferences or selection criteria in all of our competitive grant opportunities for workforce development and labor standards. When we get applications from the types of entities that apply to us, those are states, cities, transit agencies, ports. We are looking at all of those applications for whether or not they have a commitment to good paying jobs with free and fair choice to join a union. We're looking at whether or not they have quality training programs. Yes, right here on the slide, you can see high quality training programs that include supportive services and the implementation of policies that recruit and retain underrepresented workers. And I will say, this is my number one recommendation just in terms of how do you make your state's applications more competitive. It is actually address this part of all of the selection criteria. We are definitely looking at it, and it helps to get applications elevated. So oftentimes maybe an application will initially be rated as recommended, but we can move it, we can advance it to the secretary based on whether or not these criteria were addressed. All of that is explained in our notice of funding opportunities. All of our grant applications go through a senior review team process where members of the leadership do have the ability to kind of call up applications that are of interest. And this is one of the areas that, as a priority for the administration and for Secretary Buttigieg, we do call up applications based on this. In addition, it is important to know that our competitive grants can be used for workforce development as long as that workforce development is for jobs on the project. So this would be my second big recommendation. If your state is applying for grants, if you're involved in those, even if you are a state representative who gets asked to sign letters of support, you might want to look and ask, did you address the workforce and labor components of this application? And are you applying for workforce development funds? Because our state could use that. And if you put it in your budget, then you can basically just put a line item in the budget, workforce development, however much you want it to be of the total project cost. And that is allowable as long as ultimately that funding is used to support jobs on the project. What does that mean? As explained in our FAQ that we have online, that funding could be used for short-term training programs that are needed to prepare people to be able to take the jobs on the project. It could also be used to fund what some people call a jobs coordinator position, basically someone who is responsible for making sure that the workforce needs on the project are met. Oftentimes that person literally goes door to door and knocks in neighborhoods where they know that people need work and let them know about the opportunity to come into some of the entry-level construction jobs. So those are the types of expenses that can be covered by our competitive grant dollars. And this is, our RAISE grants, you may have heard of them, our mega grants, all of our rail grants. Every competitive grant the Department of Labor puts out has the same cost allocation requirements, and workforce development is allowable. So hopefully I've made that very clear and encouraged you all to put workforce development as a part of your budgets. We can move on to the next slide. The main chunk of funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law is formula funds. And that is formula funds that states get, really. So $466 billion of the $650 billion that the Department of Transportation has is formula funding. And the vast majority of that is our state highway formula funds. States are getting about $50 billion per year from federal highways in these state formula funds. And the bipartisan infrastructure law changed the rules so that all of these funds can now be spent on workforce development. I want to repeat that. All of that $50 billion could be spent on workforce development. Now, clearly, states need to build bridges and repair roads. And so there's lots of projects that states want to fund. But what I would say is that a very small percent of 50 billion is a lot of money for workforce development, right? So the states that are investing this funding in workforce development are typically investing 1% or less of their highway formula funds. But if you think about it, that is a lot of money, and that is enough to fund a significant workforce development program. So depending on the size of the state, that could be anywhere between, $5 and $20 million. That is a substantial program that can allow you to support thousands of people into infrastructure jobs. So I would highly recommend that states think about how they can use these funds. This can be done through just regular, states regularly, they go to the Federal Highway Administration, they approve all of their funding with the Federal Highway Administration. They can go about it in that way and just put workforce development as a use in there. Many states have chosen to pass laws to require a certain percent of that funding to go to workforce development. Oregon is an example where they've had the longest running program even before the bipartisan infrastructure law. They were already putting the limited amount that you could put forward for workforce development, which was not nearly all of it, is a very 0.5% of these funds. Now you can use all of it. So passing a law, putting that in guidance in your state budgets, certainly an option, but also not required. This can be done again just through the regular process of the state Federal Highway Agency, the state DOT submitting that information to the Federal Highway Agency. Our transit funds, perhaps less interesting to this group, but our transit funds can also be used for workforce development, but it is only 0.5% of the urban area formula program, which is about $6 billion per year. So much less than that amount that is available for states. Next slide. So as I started up front, the direct workforce development opportunities are rarer. Basically, it's our low or no emissions vehicle program and the consolidated rail infrastructure and safety improvement grants, which again have to be focused on rail. But that is a good opportunity. If that is, I think I saw that someone from Connecticut was on here. The states where we are building through the Northeast Corridor certainly would think about the opportunity to apply for these grants for the rail workforce, which will need to be scaled up in the next few years. And as you can see, these are big size grants that we've made to the University of Delaware as one example, to scale rail engineering programs to HBCUs, and an $8 million grant to Amtrak for a mechanic apprenticeship program. I think that's all I have, and I will stop there. I'll stop there and see if we can take some questions.
Thank you, Paige, for that presentation and highlighting the bipartisan infrastructure law and opportunities available for workforce development. We have one question. Earlier you referenced, this is for Paige, earlier you referenced supportive services. Can you elaborate more on what that means?
Yes, I would love to, because supportive services, I think, are the best way to invest in the certainly the construction workforce. So what supportive services are is any service that is necessary to get individuals through a training program and into a job and retained in their job. The way the Department of Transportation has defined it, that includes transportation to help you get to a job or a training site. That includes childcare. It includes money for tools, for clothes, equipment, as well as emergency cash assistance. And I would also add that our funding, so specifically the state funding that I mentioned, can also be used for stipends to support people while they're in training programs. The Federal Highway Administration has released formal guidance on how that $50 billion that I mentioned can be used, and it includes both supportive services and stipends. The other main supportive service I missed is temporary lodging, so it will also cover temporary lodging. To give you some examples of how this is done, again, I'll refer back to the state of Oregon, as I think they have a really great model. They have a third party that they've, they do a bid, they find a third party to go to all their project sites and support their apprentices. So these are people who are working on the ODOT projects, and the provider basically, is there to support people who are on the project. If they have car problems, if they, need support for tools, they're there to help provide that support. And that is an incredibly important time to provide those services. Most apprentices that are women and are people of color do not complete an apprenticeship program, right? The retention rates overall are only about 60%, which again, I would say is not that out of line, considering the fact that these are ultimately just jobs. You're already getting paid for it. You have work, but we would like people to be able to complete those apprenticeship programs, and the retention rates for women and people of color tend to be half of that of their white male counterparts, so about 30%, and supportive services can really help to increase those retention rates. And again, I would say that is probably the best way to support the construction workforce, because we do already have people that are in the pipeline and we want to keep them in the pipeline, and that's easier than bringing new people into the pipeline.
Thank you very much. Looks like a follow-up question to that. If you could discuss a little bit more about healthcare coverage with that particular area.
So I don't know if Emlyn has a different, I don't believe that healthcare is included in our definition of supportive services. I don't know if it would, I mean, certainly you could use it for emergency medical expenses that are needed. As a key part of our effort to support good paying jobs, we are supporting entities to use project labor agreements, or to use union workers, which then would have healthcare coverage through their union.
Thank you very much. It looks like we have 2 more questions at the moment. And again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A chat feature, or if it's easier, email myself or Dylan. But this is, I think either of you can answer it, but it's probably more for Emlyn. Are there any resources or recent success stories in using these funds, or the Good Jobs Initiative for that matter, amid labor shortages?
That's a great question. I'd have to look a little bit more closely on some specific examples, and realizing that we're still in the early stages of implementation. So a lot of these funds have been announced, but not necessarily, the projects haven't necessarily started. But the general question of how can we use these funds to address labor shortages is a really good one, and one where we feel that investing in high quality labor management training partnership programs that provide pathways to high quality jobs, the ones that, as Paige mentioned, provide benefits, are unionized, are a way of attracting workers who might have a lot of other options right now, and otherwise might not be attracted to positions in the trades and construction. So I think that as we're looking at this competitive labor environment, the differentiator for employers and also for states as they're thinking about how to attract these is how can we make sure that the participants or the potential job seekers know that these are good jobs. These are jobs that will provide benefits, family sustaining wages, and a career in the construction trades that has progression. And Paige, do you know of any more specific examples or have anything to add to that?
Well, I saw that there was a related question about more examples of what states are doing. So I think I can answer both questions. I would give the example of Idaho, which has made a decision to support worker housing from their Department of Transportation. And that does help address the issues with finding workers, because then workers who are going to projects that are far away from where they live within the state will know that temporary housing will be provided. That won't be extra money that they have to pay out of their wages. To just give some other examples of states that are investing some of these highway dollars in workforce development, Wisconsin has a program on this where they fund pre-apprenticeship and those supportive services I mentioned, and then the state of Washington, they're not using their transportation, those highway formula dollars, but they're using other revenue sources to fund investments in pre-apprenticeship across the state. And that is specifically focused on pre-apprenticeship programs that are bringing people into registered apprenticeship, so that have those strong connection points. And then there are other states that are investing in pre-apprenticeship programs. So there are a number of different examples out there. And then I would call out just that California has recently decided to invest some of their formula dollars from federal highways into workforce development. They're adding that money into their high road construction careers program, which is another great example of a program that funds pre-apprenticeship leading into registered apprenticeship across the state, provides those supportive services. They provide supportive services up to $25,000 per person in that program, which I point out because I think it's really outstanding that there's so much support available. On average, it does take about, I would say, $8,000 to $10,000 per participant to really support someone through getting these sorts of jobs. At the same time, those jobs are life-changing, and it does, it would definitely pass a cost-benefit test in the sense that people are going from making $20,000, $30,000 a year, either, in and out of jobs or in lower wage industries, to then making, depending on the local labor market, somewhere between, $40,000 or $70,000, even as, just in a laborer position. For other crafts, they're paid more than that. So that's a substantial income gain for them, for their families, and then through, taxes, and obviously through just, economics for the society writ large.
Thank you very much for that. There is one question left that I see. This is for you, Paige. In the selection criteria, one of the items you noted was implementing policies. Do these policies need to be through legislation, or can they be through administrative regulation? Is there a preference for either or?
We are really just looking, I think the way we frame it is procurement policies. And so what we're really looking for is a commitment about what you're going to put in your RFP or your bid, right? When the project is bid out by the state, what sort of requirements are going to be in that bid? For example, local hire, requirements around hiring people on the project locally from disadvantaged areas. That can be put into any, bid depending on the state. That may require passing a law, that may require, but from our standpoint, we're not necessarily looking for a state law. We just want to see it in the bid for that project that is funded with federal dollars.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you both for your wonderful presentations today. If there are no further questions, it looks like we are about to wrap up then.
Andrew, I think there's one other question in the chat that I'd love to address about specific examples of the types of infrastructure jobs that need to be filled. It's a great question. It will depend obviously on the state and region. Each state has an infrastructure coordinator that can help you to understand what projects have been announced. The White House also has some resources online to show where specific projects funded by bill and have been awarded. And that's a great starting resource to understand what types of roles are going to be in specific communities and states, because it is very dependent on the projects that will be there. But that being said, a lot of these jobs are going to be jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree, and provide pathways for folks who might not have that level of education, but do require some amount of either on-the-job training, preparation, or resources. And that's where workforce development is a really important part. That's a lot of jobs in the skilled trades. Almost all of these projects have some form of construction related. So that's a lot of roles in things like operating engineers, electricians, construction laborers, carpenters. And at the Department of Labor, we've been doing a lot of thinking on this and a lot of thinking about specific projects, and we'd love to partner with folks who are thinking about what specific projects are coming into their community, and where they can develop or fund or work to support existing high road training partnerships. So once again, encourage folks to reach out to us if you're thinking about that, and if you would like to talk more.
All right, looks like another question did just pop in. Can you give some examples of how states are reaching out to local communities to attract applicants and build trust, especially in underserved communities?
I assume this means applicants for jobs. Or I'm wondering if it means applicants for jobs or applicants for transportation projects in local areas. I'll assume it means jobs. So yes, we as another criteria and administration priority, we are really focused on authentic community engagement. And also ask applicants to address how they have engaged the community in understanding the need for the transportation project that's being proposed, and the benefits that and potential costs that it might have for the community. We would love to see jobs be more a part of that conversation. I would say it's not as typical as I would like, but certainly, the jobs that are available on the project can be an important benefit for the community if the right sorts of programs are in place. And what that normally looks like is working with community-based providers to recruit people for the project, so that there are trusted members of the community that are actually involved in that recruitment. And then that can be formalized through some sort of local hire requirement, like I mentioned, in terms of, the people on the project that have to come from certain disadvantaged zip codes or come from certain pre-apprenticeship programs. That's another way to do local hire. And then also you can use community benefits agreements, which are agreements not just with unions, the collective bargaining piece, but also with the broader community. And examples I've seen for, just to give one is having a scholarship fund that is, part of that contractors are putting into that creates education opportunities for youth in the area, right? So community benefits agreements can also have, benefits around, climate or, education, healthcare, but certainly jobs would be one of the main ones. And then that can ensure that you have that local labor market on the project.
All right, well, thank you. I do see one other question just came in. So are there any examples of what reporting and data collection that state legislators should request to make sure that they're seeing the outcomes for women and people of color in infrastructure jobs? The person who asked this question says that we've tried this for apprenticeships, but think that there need to be more across these funding opportunities.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the data collection and reporting is a huge part of this. It will be ultimately important to understand if we're meeting what we define as success, at the Department of Labor, we have put together a resource to help states, federal agencies, and others think through the types of data that they might want to collect, both in terms of the project level labor standards that could apply to projects to understand whether or not they do have project labor agreements, whether they do offer supportive services, but then also in terms of the actual outcomes, the number of folks who are ultimately employed and the amount of job hours that they work across different racial and ethnic groups, women, people of color. And that is a resource that's available. But we also, again, would love to partner with folks who are thinking through that at the state level to understand what might make sense for their specific state and how we could help them to think through that.
I want to hop in here too. Love this question. It is a priority of mine right now. For background, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Department of Transportation is required to release model plans for states and cities around how to expand diversity in the construction workforce. And a part of that is around model plans for local hire. It will also address other workforce strategies. So we are preparing we are working on that, those set of model plans, which congressionally are supposed to be released on the 2nd year anniversary of the infrastructure law. DOT may not necessarily meet that deadline, but we will get it done. The lack of data has been a major challenge. There are very few entities that actually publicize their data. I put a link to the city of Seattle in the chat. I hope I'm not, biased here. I did used to work, not for the city of Seattle, but for King County. But I do think it is actually the best data that I've seen. What we have found is that when we reach out to a state or a city, they can normally get us the data. So they are tracking it. They have ways to get at it. And that is because they are required to do Davis-Bacon payroll records. And oftentimes that is the system that they use for Davis-Bacon payroll can also help them to track the demographics of workers on the projects and the zip codes that those workers are coming from. So it is attainable data, but it's not necessarily put out publicly in the way that I think we would want for public accountability. And it's often not put out in a way that allows to see the trend lines. So maybe they'll put out data for, this year and then the next year, but they won't really kind of make the connection between what are they doing better? Or are they doing worse? Is it stagnating? So that is definitely an area of interest. And we are, if it's okay, I'll put in the chat a link to a webinar that we're going to have on June 29th, which is focused on local hire. And we will include in that a discussion of how to track data on the project workforce. And then we'll be certainly putting out more information when we get to that congressionally required report.
Thank you both for your answers there. I do not see any other questions, but I am going to pause again to make sure that I'm not missing any again. So if there's any questions looming, this is the last call for that. Please ask them if they're on your mind. All right, well, last double check. Okay. Well, again, I'd like to thank our presenters. Thank you all for presenting today and for giving your insight for your respective agencies. I'd also like to thank all of you for attending and for all of your great questions. We look forward to hearing more in the months ahead about how your states are addressing and funding workforce development. If you have any questions for the presenters or CSG East staff, please reach out. If there are no further questions, that will conclude our webinar. Have a wonderful day and weekend.